Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Apologies for being late. I think it's something to do with the Buckinghamshire traffic lights. Anyway, good morning and welcome. I believe that you've all got a copy of my chairman's announcements, and I think you've probably all read those. As you can see from that, we are doing our recruiting campaigns for flexi firefighters, and that's going well. And we've had a really good response for that. And we then go into the electronic agenda packs that was mentioned at Overview and Audit Committee. And if there is any member that requires a printed paper, please would they talk to Katie Nellist. I have to have a printed paper because I can't read an iPad screen properly. So I always have mine in paper format, and it's easier to write on. So if anybody wants it, please will they just talk with Katie, and that will be arranged. But if you don't want a printed copy, perhaps you would just confirm that that's not what you want so that everybody is aware of your requirements. Yes? Is that okay? Great. Are there any questions? So we then go on to, this is December meeting, so the one just before Christmas, and I do hope that we do have a good Christmas, especially with the rising numbers of COVID. Members of the public are allowed to attend and observe in limited numbers, as we are well aware. We are going to be recording the meeting, and a copy will be uploaded onto the authority's YouTube channel later on. To comply with social distancing guidelines, some officers will be contributing to the meeting remotely. And in order to facilitate the best possible experience for all those participating in the meeting, can I please ask for those participating in the meeting remotely that they switch off their microphones and their cameras when not speaking. You will be audible and visible in the recording of the meeting if you do not do so. If remote participants wish to speak during the meeting, please turn on your camera to indicate a wish to respond and to question or make a comment. Officers in the room with me this morning are as follows: Mick Osborne, Mark Hemming, Graham Britton, Ali Quainton, Adam Birch, Katie Nellist. And as already advised, Buckinghamshire Council now requires the Oculus for another meeting and have asked that the Fire Authority meeting is concluded before 1 p.m. to allow them to clean and set up to the COVID-19 variant, which means, Ms. Councillor Suchbury, keep your questions to a minimum, please.
Would I ever?
Thank you. Agenda item 1 is apologies. Do we have any apologies?
Yeah, Councillor Darlington and Lambert.
Minutes of the meeting, which was held on the 13th of October. Are you happy that I sign those as a true record? Great. We then go to the matters arising from the minutes, the previous minutes. Are there any matters arriving? Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, Chairman. From minute FA 21 of the authority meeting the 13th of October, in connection with the officer's report about the authority's people strategy, I asked the question of the Chief Fire Officer and the Deputy Chief Fire Officer about the culture of Buckinghamshire Fire and Rescue Service, particularly in light of the horrific events arising from the actions of serving Metropolitan Police officers. I was heartened by the Chief's response, which are recorded in the minutes in respect of the acknowledgement of the need to redouble events within the Fire and Rescue Service to ensure that its hard-earned public trust is not tarnished, and also for services to better reflect the communities in which they serve. I'm aware that the Home Secretary has commissioned Sir Tom Windsor, Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabularies and Fire and Rescue Services, to undertake a thematic inspection of the vetting and counter-corruption procedures in policing across England and Wales with a view to strengthening these procedures. May I ask what vetting of firefighters is currently undertaken by Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes Fire and Rescue Service? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I'm happy to respond on behalf of the Chief Fire Officer, who unfortunately can't be with us in person today. But in response to your question, Councillor, Buckinghamshire Fire and Rescue Service uses Buckinghamshire Council as its umbrella body to undertake DBS checks on recruits and 3 yearly renewals for employees. In 2016, Buckinghamshire Fire and Rescue Service moved to require enhanced DBS vetting in order to allow us to obtain details on applicants' convictions and cautions, both spent and unspent, police reprimands and warnings, and relevant police information. To achieve this was somewhat of an uphill struggle, with the umbrella body as the role of a firefighter is not an accepted occupation in the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act 1974 Exceptions Order 1975, nor is the firefighter's role a regulated activity as defined by the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act 2006. This means that enhanced DBS checks cannot be undertaken universally across the fire and rescue sector as a matter of course, nor even the less stringent standard DBS checks. However, enhanced DBS vetting was something that the Chief Fire Officer pushed for, and in which he was supported by the Fire Brigades Union locally in order to guard and protect the trusted brand which enables close working by our firefighters with vulnerable groups, young people, blue light partners and healthcare providers. The cost of Buckinghamshire Fire and Rescue Service of enhanced DBS checks reduced from £44 per cheque to £40 per cheque on the 1st of October 2019, with the 3 yearly update fees being £13. In July 2019, in advance of the National Fire Chiefs Council adopting its safeguarding position statement, the Chief Fire Officer wrote to the National Fire Chiefs Council expressing his disappointment about the lack of progress made by the sector to increase the vetting of its employees. It had been the agreed position over 2 years previously in the Chief Fire Officers Association National Fire and Rescue Service People Strategy 2017 to 22 that DBS checks for all firefighters need to become the norm. The National Fire Chiefs Council Safeguarding Position Statement adopted in 2020 states that the National Fire Chiefs Council endorses the position that basic disclosure checking is used as a minimum to ensure the suitability of staff and volunteers to undertake their roles. The National Fire Chiefs Council recommends that the disclosure and barring service is utilised for all roles which bring staff and volunteers into contact with the public. The National Fire Chiefs Council encourages fire and rescue services to consider the need for increased level of checks for these roles that are required to carry out specific or regulated activities. The basic DBS certificate contains details of only unspent criminal convictions, conditional and unconditional cautions, or a statement that the individual has no such convictions or cautions. It currently costs £23, the same as a standard DBS check. The Chief Fire Officer, as well as requesting the National Fire Chiefs Council in July 2019 that its safeguarding position statement be strengthened to endorse standard DBS checking as the minimum requirement, has been lobbying the Home Office to bring forward legislation to amend the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act 1974 Exceptions Order 1975 so that vetting procedures for firefighters are strengthened as a matter of course in every fire and rescue service. The Chief Fire Officer has been supporting the National Fire Chiefs Council strategic lead for safeguarding in her submission of a series of business cases to the Home Office, the latest version of which was submitted on Wednesday the 17th of November, which put the case that a change in national legislation is long overdue and should be enacted as soon as possible.
With what you've just said, are you happy that we were to look at putting forward a letter from the leaders of the Fire Authority to push for an enhanced DBS check? I do know that there has been a business case at the Home Office for some 2 years now, and I do know that Mr. Britton is very much involved in trying to push this forward, as is the Chief Fire Officer. And I think it's something that perhaps if we get behind, we can actually deal with.
Well, firstly, thank you, Mick, for a very comprehensive response. I couldn't have expected a more comprehensive response. And yes, Chairman, I would fully support that and think that's an excellent idea.
Councillor Mallon, would you agree to a joint letter to the Home Office? Unfortunately, Councillor Lambert's not here, but I will ask him if that is the case. Thank you very much indeed.
Chairman, could that letter also be sent to the NFCC simultaneously to the one going to the Home Office?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you very much indeed. Are there any disclosures of interest for the meeting? No? And the matters arising, we're going through petitions. Are there any petitions?
None, Chairman.
Thank you. The second recommendation from the committee, the Overview and Audit Committee, was the Environment and Climate Action Plan recommendations, which is on page 5.
Chairman, before we do that, we should probably take the appointment of external auditors, because that is a decision. Sorry. I think we should probably take the appointment of external auditors to get that approved by the authority first.
Oh, sorry, yes, I'm too far down. Apologies. I'm trying to gallop through this now. Recommendation from the committee, the Overview and Audit Committee on the 10th of November was the appointment of the internal auditors. The recommendation was on page 4. Councillor Hopkins, would you like to introduce this, and then we'll hand over to Mr. Hemmings?
I just pass it straight across to Mark to come in. I think it speaks for itself.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Vice Chairman. So, as noted, this went to the Overview and Audit Committee in November. It's coming to the full Fire Authority because that's the requirement of the Public Sector Audit Appointments Limited, is that it's a decision of the full authority, not a committee, that we opt into this agreement. So this is the options for securing external audit services from the year 23-24. There's broadly 2 options. We can either opt into the national agreement, which we're part of at the moment, or we can look to do our own local audit appointment. The recommendation here is that we opt into the national agreement for a number of reasons, not least because of the economies of scale that it offers. We're likely to get a much better scale fee by opting in. And I know we've had issues with audits recently, but doing our own local audit won't solve those problems because we'd still be picking from the same limited pool of audit bodies that are approved. So therefore the recommendation is we opt into the national agreement again, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Are there any questions? Councillor Sutchbury.
Not a question, just an observation. I've got nothing further to question on it. It thoroughly went through in the Audit Committee and the recommendation comes through there. I'm happy to support it, Chairman, in its entirety.
Councillor Carroll.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Just the same, I was chairing the meeting and we fully support this. It's a good way forward, Mark. Thank you. And for your hard work.
So it's recommended that there are 2 recommendations, and we then have to go to the second recommendation, which is the Environment and Climate Action Plan.
That first recommendation is passed, Chairman.
The Environment and Climate Action Plan be recommended to the authority for approval, which I do support, and the authority recommend to nominate and appoint a lead member for the climate change. Now, my nomination would be for Councillor Hopkins because of the financial issues that the climate change might bring, and he would be the first person to actually know whether and how we could deal with this, and my nomination would be for Councillor Hopkins. Do I have a seconder for that? Thank you. There's several. So I think Councillor McLean was first up, and then Councillor Carroll supported it, and Councillor Rankin also.
And we'll just need to see if there are any other eligible members from the Executive
Are
Committee.
there any other eligible members from the Executive Committee? Any nominations? No? Therefore, the proposed nomination of Councillor Hopkins has been seconded by several members. Are we in agreement? Please, could you show your hands? That's unanimous.
That's passed, Chairman.
We then go on to item 9, which is pages 39 to 64. That's the financial strategy.
I'm surprised we're not, that we've appointed the executive to actually talk about the climate action plan. It seems a big step forward.
I'm sorry,
that
we've already passed over that, Councillor Stutchbury.
Well,
we were doing the recommendation from the overview and audit. It's not the place here to actually discuss
thank you.
it.
Yeah, okay.
So,
It's just I thought it was
sorry.
quite a positive thing
I'm
to talk
sorry.
about, but never mind. Missed the
Yes,
opportunity,
fine.
haven't we?
Fine, thank you very much. Item 9 is on pages 39 to 64, and which is the financial strategy. And I hand over to Councillor Hopkins, and then I believe, Mr Hemmings, you were going to be taking us through this.
Well, thank you, Chair. I can add no value more than pass straight across to Mark, because it's his presentation.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Vice Chairman. Good morning, members. It's nice to be here in front of you in person. I'm going to have to remember to look up from my laptop occasionally to appreciate your faces as we go through this. So this is the first annual update on the financial strategy, which was approved by the Fire Authority last year. So I'm just going to talk you through kind of what's happened since in terms of progress against the action plan and also where we are against the aims we set out this time last year. So just by starting off looking at progress to date. So the first year's activities, I'll touch briefly on these. Some of these are covered on later slides, as you see. So amongst activities for the first year, we're continuing to lobby for an increase in council tax referendum limits and for other grants to become part of the settlement funding assessment. The initial value for money review, looking at our estate footprints, a review of our partnership arrangements, and a report will be coming to the Executive Committee in March next year regarding that. Establishment of the Portfolio Management Office, and then recruiting a pensions officer. As members will be aware, the amount of work that's been done on pensions over the last number of years has increased dramatically. And I'm glad to say we have now appointed a dedicated pensions officer who started with us earlier this month. In terms of the second year activities, we're going to review the system requirements and either upgrade or replace the main finance and HR systems. As it was, we decided to stick with the current system because of the cost of change would have been very high, and actually the system works very well for what we need it for. And actually in terms of the system, we did get an award for the implementation of the system and national recognition as to how well we'd done it. We decided to stick with what works for us. We're to review the budget monitoring and performance management arrangements and also look at the skill set of non-finance staff and elected members. And that'll be an activity we undertake in the last quarter of this financial year. So just a little bit more detail on some of those activities. So one of the things we had done was a value for money review. So this was done by a company called Proving Services Limited, who's done this for a number of fire and rescue services. We were the 8th one to be reviewed. So it involves senior management team, a number of self-assessment questionnaires, looking at other external reports, customer feedback, trying to gauge economy, efficiency, stakeholder value to come to an overall view of kind of where we are as a service. And so these are some direct quotes from the company that did the assessment. So it notes that we perform as strongly as any in terms of economy and efficiency, and in terms of effectiveness and outcomes, we perform similarly to the better performing services. And if you look at the chart on the screen there, it looks at economy and efficiency against effectiveness and strategic value. The best place to be is as far close to the top right as you can be. And you'll notice that compared to other services, we do compare very favourably in terms of this value for money assessment, which is a real positive. So some of the key performance points that came out was these are areas for improvement. So some of the areas they noted for further improvement include looking at performance management framework, so making sure that our objectives and metrics line up with what we're trying to achieve. Improving stakeholder engagement, so working with the communities and engaging with them effectively. And staff productivity, which is a key national theme at the moment, making the best use of our resources. For example, operational staff doing increased prevention protection work. And then a sub-recommendation just to continue the rollout of the management training we're doing at the moment, so that staff are best equipped to deal with the flexible requirements of the roles. In terms of looking at our budget monitoring performance reporting arrangements, there is a wider review of the framework which is underway. One of the initial things we're going to propose to start from next year is to start to bring together the workforce planning and the financial reporting all into one place. The figure there is just illustrative of operational staff, and the proposal there is we have a budgeted establishment at the moment. As workforce planning starts to become a little bit more predictable, as pensions issues start to settle down, the proposal is to have a maximum and minimum, which is kind of just above and just below that establishment, and look to kind of, at some points we'll go over, some points we'll go under, and then use reserve to smooth out the variation there. Because of the way we have to recruit, you can't just take 1 or 2 staff on at a time in terms of operational staff. You generally have a minimum number of 8 to take on at a time. So in order to make sure we've got enough staff to keep all our engines on the run, this is our proposal going forwards. And we'll bring that ready to members so you can see how we're progressing against that in relation to our finances. So I'll then come on to progress to date against some of the aims in the strategy. So we categorised our aims into 4 key areas covering performance, people, governance and external factors. So in terms of performance, one of our aims was to have the ability to increase council tax above the current limit of 2%. So in the budget this year announced recently, the indicative limit remained at 2% for all local authorities. We have got another second bite of the cherry, as it were, because we're waiting on the results of the local government finance assessment, which is where referendum limits will be fully confirmed. We expect that to be announced next week, so fairly imminently. What we have done, and this was a recommendation from HMI, was to engage with the public about kind of what should we do if we don't have kind of any more finances coming from the government in terms of grant settlement. And overwhelmingly, the public's preference is to increase council tax when compared to other examples such as closing fire stations, reducing prevention work, reducing education, etc. So that's kind of very interesting, and we'll wait and see what happens next week in terms of settlement as to whether that's even an option or not. Another key performance point was trying to bring some of the grant funding into our core settlement funding assessment. There's been a number of grants which have kind of been approved just on a year-by-year basis, which makes planning long-term very uncertain. So pleased to say that the pensions funding, which is £1.2 million a year, will be rolled into our core settlement funding from next year. So that's now in our base funding, which is a real positive. That leaves 2 grants which sit outside of the SFA. Firelink, which covers our kind of control radios, etc. That will be discontinued from 25-26 anyway, when they bring in an ESMCP. That leaves USAR, and there is an upcoming USAR review, the timing of which is still uncertain, but we are investing as much in USAR as possible to make sure we're in the best position for that. Members approved the construction of the USAR rig to go in at Aylesbury recently, and just this morning they were taking down the old tower. We had a big crane in doing that, so work is progressing with that. That should be done by the end of the financial year, which is another really good step forwards. The other performance measure we wanted to increase on was increasing expenditure on frontline staff as a percentage of total expenditure. Unfortunately, that's something we've not yet been able to do, simply because we haven't been able to generate any additional funding due to council tax referendum limits remaining at 2% for last year. If we did have the £5, we'd be looking initially to spend it on increasing the firefighting establishment, including flexi firefighters, prevention and protection staff, and improving the availability of on-call stations. The next performance measure was looking at reducing our overhead costs, primarily through reducing the size of the estate. So part of this is looking to leverage some of the benefits of the increased working at home that we've managed to do throughout the pandemic. There's a longer term project to exit Unit 7, which is the building we'd normally have these kind of meetings in, but there's a large amount of work to do in terms of relocating stores, use our equipment, things like that, so that's not a quick win. We are doing some things where we can to share our estates and therefore spread the cost. So we've got projects which are underway or shortly due to commence at Newport Pagnell and Princess Risborough to share our estate with the police. And we're also in initial conversations with Thames Valley Air Ambulance to use Marlow as a standby point. I'll just clarify that is for their ground-based support vehicles. We're not looking at putting a helipad onto Marlow, just to be clear. We have also successfully challenged rateable values on a number of our sites. So we did this year get a one-off rebate of about £250,000, which is good. So we're doing everything we can to reduce the cost of our sites there. And the Environment and Climate Action Plan, which was mentioned earlier, will hopefully, over the next few years, start to work towards reducing our energy costs as we become more energy efficient. The next performance measure was around borrowing, and the aim was to not take on any additional borrowing and repay any deals that have matured, which we've done. The chart there, I should just clarify, the horizontal axis there isn't time, it's different fire services. So that's each of the standalone fire services and looking at their borrowing in relation to their core spending power. We are the gold bar, which is roughly in the middle, so we're probably average in terms of our borrowing against our budget, which is kind of a reassuring position to be in. Because we haven't had any additional flexibility on council tax, one option we may consider in future is increasing our borrowing if we need to in order to fund our capital programme. At the moment, our capital programme is funded almost entirely through revenue, so we could look to free up some of that if we needed to in the future. And then just coming on to reserves, so there was an aim to maintain reserves at current levels. And looking at the chart, you'll see that actually the forecast balances were very, very close to the year-end balances, so that was reassuring. Just a couple of bits to note there. Other earmarked reserves, that balance eventually went to revenue contributions to capital, so if you were to put those two dark blue bars together, that would be in line with the forecast. The other line there, which I'd point out, is Referendum Reserve. So members approved £600,000 to go into a reserve for a potential referendum in a future year. Depending on what the settlement says next week, we'll need to make a decision at the Fire Authority in February as to whether we utilise that reserve to fund a referendum or we unearmark it and use it for other purposes. In terms of the people aims, I've put these all on one slide for expedience. So the aim was to do a minor change to the staff structure to incorporate a dedicated pensions officer, which, as I said earlier, we've done. And this was done without increasing the overall number of finance, procurement or payroll staff. We rearranged the existing structure to incorporate that with no additional headcount and no additional cost. We're looking to retain existing staff expertise, knowledge and skills as far as possible. This is an area where we have struggled a little bit, so we have seen a couple of payroll staff have left. And we are starting to struggle to recruit, perhaps where we haven't done so in the past. I think it's probably a symptom of where we are in terms of the recruitment market is becoming more challenging, but is something we'll keep pressing on with. And we have got the success, as I said, with the pensions officer. We've got a couple of vacant positions which we're hoping to fill shortly. And the other aims were just to continue to work closely with the lead member and that the Chief Finance Officer remains a member of the senior management team, both of which we do. So just in terms of governance, just some of the objectives here. So we wanted to make sure that the newly established Portfolio Management Office supports the finance and wider organisation to deliver that transformational change. I don't expect you to be able to read all of those little bubbles in that funnel. That's just to give members an idea of kind of the competing priorities we're having to deal with. So we've got HMI, Home Office, we've got Culture Survey, Public Safety Plan, other strategic policies, Climate Action Plan, and it's trying to boil all of those down with the limited resources we've got, trying to focus on our key priorities. And that's something the newly established Portfolio Management Office is helping us to do really well. And again, that links into the recommendation coming from the Value for Money survey. Actually, let's focus on those core objectives and get those performance metrics to make sure we're doing the right things in a timely manner. Just a couple of other governance aims. So the one I mentioned earlier around doing the assessment of non-finance staff skills, which we'll do in Q4. Mentioned systems already. And then policies updated to reflect changes in legislation is something we'll do on an ongoing basis. I will just touch briefly, because it links to this one, on the external pensions remedy. So we aim to have the pensions remedy fully implemented, and I'm pleased to say we have done as much as we possibly can on this. So although legislation is not due until October 23, we did make the decision in March to pay prospective cases, and then very recently we adopted the immediate detriment framework. We're targeting to get all retrospective cases remedied by April 2022. There has been a slight development on this since I did these slides, that the Home Office, slightly unhelpfully, have withdrawn the guidance they initially issued a number of months ago. So we're now waiting on an updated LGA position. They're getting some legal advice just to see what that means for us. At the moment, the plan is to continue as we have done, with working through the calculations, and I'll keep members updated on that one. And just a couple of the other external aims were that finances are able to respond to changes in user demand and profile. So you'll be aware Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes are quite quickly growing areas of the country. So making sure that our stations and resources are in the right places for the longer term future. And then making sure our external partners have the same high standards that we do. And as mentioned earlier, we'll bring a paper regarding that in March to give members that reassurance. Another external point was HMIC FRS. So our last report from the Inspectorate said we don't have enough money because of the funding situation we find ourselves in. We'll receive our second report later this month. I think it's expected next Wednesday it will be published. Since the cause for concern was raised in our last report, our funding position hasn't improved significantly, so I'm not expecting massive changes in terms of their opinion at this point in time in relation to efficiency. Just a couple of other points. So we wanted our influence with the NFCC and Home Office to secure a good funding settlement. So as I mentioned earlier, the provisional settlement is due next week. I'm expecting either Wednesday or Thursday. The headline increases announced in the budget were around 3% for local government. However, I would expect the fire sector will be lower than this. And actually that settlement includes the additional cost of national insurance contributions. So whilst we're getting funded for it, it's kind of giving with one hand, taken with the other in that respect. But we will, of course, bring forward a full report as part of the MTFP process that will come to the Authority and Executive Committee in February. Whatever the settlement looks like, the good news is we are expecting a 3-year settlement. So whether it's good, bad or indifferent, it at least gives us some certainty to plan to going forwards. So we haven't had a multi-year settlement since 2019-20 was the last year of a multi-year settlement. So just to sum up the key points. So our funding position hasn't improved significantly since the Inspectorate raised the cause for concern. The 3-year spending review will give us some more certainty, whether that's good, bad or indifferent. We'll find out the council tax referendum limits later this month, and then putting all of that together will determine how many firefighters and appliances and other support staff, etc., we can afford over the next 3-year period. I'm happy to take any questions on any of that.
Councillor Stutchbury.
Firstly, thank you for the report, but this is the first time I've ever seen a financial report without any figures in, which is an interesting way to look at things. Perhaps it's just me. If you read the report as it is, there's two things which do raise concerns. One is the retention of staff, in the sense that we've got a dip in employment and we have an aspiration to employ more staff, yet we can't do that till later in the financial year. The other thing in the report, we mention if we cannot get X, Y and Z from the financial settlement, we have a situation where we have to look at the estates. It's difficult to assess what that means just looking at the estates, because that could be broad. It could be buildings which we don't use for front-end firefighter service. It could be buildings which are no longer functioning. It's not very easy to assess what that actually means. So I'd like to have a little explanation around that. And maybe if these figures went to the Executive Committee, the financial figures, perhaps we should have seen them here. would have made easier to read one to the other. Maybe I'm a little old-fashioned, but that's how I'm used to seeing things. And if you can answer those 2 points, I'd be really grateful. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly, Councillor. Thank you for those questions. So in terms of why this report doesn't have any figures generally, this is looking at the strategy rather than detailed budget. So the detailed budget will come to the Executive Committee in February to then be recommended to the Fire Authority for approval also in February. I didn't want to put any figures in this report because I didn't want to second guess the settlement, which is next week. I could have given you lots of figures and they would have been out of date in 7 days' time. So we'll bring that more detailed report over the coming months. In terms of staff retention, I was talking specifically around finance just from this point of view. Recruitment, actually, we are out to recruit for operational firefighters at the moment. I think we're recruiting for around about 18 posts. I think we've shortlisted, following final interviews, I think 23 firefighters for medicals. So on the operational side of it, we have had some really good interest and we have got some really, really good candidates there. So that's really encouraging. It seems to be in slightly more specialised roles, which are a bit more niche, that we are struggling a little bit, but we'll continue to press forward with that. Then in terms of looking at the size of the estates and the buildings, that is primarily around Unit 7, which is primarily a non-operational building, although it does have our operational stores and our urban search and rescue team. At this moment in time, we are not looking to reduce the number of fire stations, although depending on the settlement and any flexibility or not, there may be some difficult decisions to make longer term.
Thank you. Councillor Christensen.
Thank you. Thank you for the report. It's really useful. When I started to read the papers, it started to feel a little bit like Groundhog Day at the beginning on slide number 3. We'll continue to lobby for an increase in council tax referendum, which I've spoken about before, and I've never been comfortable that essentially lobbying seemed to be our only option. Then I've gone to the further pages, and that's where actually the reason I say I welcome, and I really do appreciate the report, because you're doing a remarkable job in buying us some time. Yeah, we've still got this issue coming down the road, and we can't, we have to find a long-term solution for that. But it's really good to see the amount of effort and work that's being put in to finding every possible saving at every possible juncture to buy us that time we so desperately need. So thank you for that. On slide 14, in terms of our borrowing, not so much a question, just more request for the minutes. You did clarify very well that you're talking about borrowing for capital budget, not for revenue. I'm not sure the slide says that clearly, because when I read it in advance, my question was, are we really going to borrow for revenue? Because that would be a terrible idea. So if the minutes could just pick up Mark's comment that that's capital budget. And then the last question, just on slide 22, when you talk about headline increases for local government of circa 3%, would I be right in saying that actually represents a net reduction to us as a service on the basis of national insurance increases and the government, well, not government, the Bank of England now predicting inflation topping 5% next year?
Yeah, just sorry to clarify on that one. The 3% should be a real terms increase, so the inflation will be covered. We'll have to knock a bit off of the national insurance bit, but it should still be a slight increase, real terms, if that kind of pans out and averages out across the whole of the kind of local government sector.
I think we all echo your sentiments in thanking Mark and his team and Asif for all the work they do. Councillor Rankin, please.
Thank you, Chair. I have a comment and a couple of questions. The comment is around the 3-year settlement. So we have a new Secretary of State, and although the Chancellor indicated 3 years for settlement, the new Secretary of State for Housing, Communities, Levelling Up, Union, wants to stamp his authority, and there's a train of thought that he actually might go for a 1-year settlement again. So just as a word of caution that it might not be 3 years. The questions are around the reserve for the referendum. It's really for my own clarity, since I'm fairly new to this authority. So I just wonder, first question is, does the reserve contain an amount for campaigning? because, you know, it's one thing to ask residents for more money, but, you know, unless you give them good reason for it, and assume that there must be money, not just for the administration side of the referendum, but also for a decent amount for the campaigning side. That's one question. The other question is around how many local authorities have actually run referendums, fire authorities have run referendums, and how successful have they been?
Okay, no, thank you for those questions, Councillor Rankin. Yeah, I am aware of some of the rumours that it may not be a 3-year settlement, although I am hoping that even if it's not, we will at least get indicative figures for years 2 and 3. I am aware that Michael Gove has kind of come in there and he's wanting to look at everything and everything. So he's looking at kind of the funding formulas over the next few years as well. So, yeah, even with a 3-year settlement, there would still be a degree of uncertainty, but at least we'd have more certainty than we've had in the recent past, I think is the aspiration there. In terms of the Referendum Reserve, there wasn't specifically an amount for campaigning. That £600,000 was based on an estimate of the one referendum that has been run recently. And to answer the second point of your question, that was from Bedfordshire Police and Crime Commissioner, and they were unsuccessful in their attempts to increase council tax by more than the referendum limit. I'm not aware of any other services that have done so recently, and certainly not any fire services.
David Hopkins, sorry, Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you, Anders and Alan, because you both asked questions that I was going to ask, and we had the response. But I'm going to just push the point on borrowing a little bit further, and before the Progressive Alliance prepare a media release, I'm not advocating this for one moment, but in terms of borrowing, what is our borrowing position? Remember, at the end of the day, we are charged with delivering the most efficient, modern fire service, and if push came to shove, we may have to consider borrowing to continue to deliver that. What is our borrowing position?
Okay, so in terms of our current borrowing outstanding, it's roughly just under £7 million. In terms of recommendations for borrowing, it's not something I would wholeheartedly recommend as a financial professional. We don't technically have a borrowing limit. We have a prudential limit, so it's whatever we consider is affordable, sustainable, we can borrow up to. Certainly wouldn't advocate borrowing for revenue and for day-to-day purposes. I think the only consideration where we may want to borrow would be, at the moment, within our capital reserves, we kind of have enough to fund our regular fleet replacement programme and any essential property works. What we don't have is any money in there to do like a major refurbishment, and we do have some stations that are now starting to show their age a little bit and may need either a major overhaul, or in some cases it may even be more cost effective to knock it down and rebuild it in situ. So I think that is probably the situation where we may need to consider borrowing for that longer term big one-off purchases.
Councillor Hall.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Other organisations that I've been involved with are seeing huge budgetary pressures around recruitment, i.e. you advertise a post at a rate and nobody comes forward, so you have to increase that rate quite substantially. So have we got any kind of contingency going forward when key posts come up and we need to basically go with the market and increase our rates? And secondly, probably not one for you, Mark, but can someone define what a flexi firefighter is, please?
Okay, right, certainly. So in terms of provision for increasing market rate, we don't have any specific contingents in there to do so at the moment. We do have a small number of posts where we have applied a market supplement. So we really struggled for a number of years with our workshops department recruiting skilled technicians to work on our appliances. So that does attract a market rate, and where we've needed a market rate in the past, we built that in as part of the budget planning process. So we've identified that and built it in for the following year's budget. So it is something we're aware of. I'm looking at Mick. Mick's going to help me out on the flexi firefighter one. I do know, but I'm sure Mick can articulate much better than I can.
I'm not sure about that, but no. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for the question. I'm guessing you're mentioning what was in the Chairman's announcements around flexi firefighters. So we have our traditional whole-time firefighters that we recruit to, but the flexi firefighters is something that we've developed. It's quite unique, in UK Fire and Rescue Service. So they're firefighters that aren't allocated to a particular station or specific watch, and we use those to cover sort of gaps in the organisation. So where traditionally, years ago, we used to have what was called a ridership factor, where we used to employ more than one person for every role, so that we could cover off things like sickness and training, etc. Where we've had to cut our cloth, as it were, over the last number of years, rather than us give up any appliances or fire stations, as it were, we've looked to develop the role of a firefighter into a different offering. So our flexi firefighters, instead of us having a set amount on a watch that's there every single day, when people do take leave, we plug those gaps with flexi firefighters who work mainly days, because they're the areas that we find it difficult to cover with bank shifts. So they're slightly more flexible, they're more peripatetic, and we get good value for money from them, but they're paid a premium for that.
And notwithstanding, the culture is very good. People mix very much better. And so some of the worries that we have with misogynists and things like that, and that seems to also help get rid of that issue that we've seen elsewhere. So it is a good way of mixing people and also using people's skills. So it's been really good. Councillor Marland.
Thank you. I just, as a former accountant, although having spent 8 years as leader of a council, that licence to practice has stopped. I do echo Councillor Stutchbury's sort of shock that there are no figures in it, because whilst I understand it's a strategy is generally sort of like looking to perform an outcome, and I don't get a sense of how big the gap is in a quantifiable term, and what the strategy is. And I think this relates to Christiansen's point is, other than a council tax rise, what's the long-term strategy to close that gap if this authority does not win its battle to put up council tax by £5? Because there was an authority that had this strategy in the past, and that was Northamptonshire, and I don't want to keep going back to that, but their strategy was, well, at some point the government must cave in, because if they don't, we will go bust, and the government didn't cave in, they went bust. And I agree that the performance and the highlight of this strategy is we're putting this off, we're doing it quite well, but if nothing changes, then it's a crunch time. And I suppose it's not what is in the document that worries me, it's what's not in the document. And I get the sense that really what's not in the document may be being thought about, but not necessarily being brought before this authority or the public. And so my question is, if the authority is not allowed to put up council tax by £5, what is the quantifiable gap? What measures would have to be taken? And if you know what those measures are they already in train? Are they being thought through? And if they are being thought through, at what point can they be shared with the authority?
Okay, I see Jason wants to
that in your lap.
come in. Sorry, I see Jason's got his hand up. I don't know if Jason wants to come in first, and I can add to anything Jason says.
Sorry, I didn't see your hand up.
It's okay. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. I think in terms of the quantifiable gap, I think it's for us and for all local authorities, we won't know until we get to see the local government finance settlement. And at that point, I think that actually we will know what that quantifiable gap is. Luckily, and what relating to what Mark said in terms of hopefully we should have a 3-year settlement, at that point we'll be able to anticipate what that quantifiable gap will be and what measures we'll have to take to bridge that gap. There are thought processes going on already about in terms of looking at the budget, in terms of where we can save funding, etc. But one thing we don't want to do is say, right, okay, this is what we're going to do, unless if we don't get the money, blah, 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 until we know what that gap is. But any plans in terms of fire stations, any plans in terms of cutting the budget, in any year will have to come through the authority, firstly through a number of planning days with the authority members, and then through in the public domain in these fire authority meetings. So there are considerations being thought of all of the time, but we're not there yet until we understand what the quantifiable gap is. But we're not very far away from it now. I think Mark has said in terms of we'll be bringing the budget early next year, and at that point, I think that we will be bringing together proposals as well over the next year to say this is how we bridge any gaps that there are.
So to come back on that, when I used to set a budget for the medium and long term, I would effectively take to the board or a set of scenarios, a low, medium and high risk scenario. And from what I'm hearing is senior officers do know what the high risk scenario is and have probably put numbers to it. And you know probably what the low risk scenario is and you've probably put numbers to it. And within those two bookends, there will be a spectrum of things that you need to do. I think it's incumbent that the authority should see those early, to be perfectly honest, because it cannot be right to say we don't know what's going to happen until next month. That's right, that's absolutely right. You do not know for certain what's going to happen, but you must have the knowledge that on one end of the spectrum this may happen, and on the other end of the spectrum this may happen. Most local authorities, as in Milton Keynes, have laid out those scenarios, the high end, the low end, and the medium risk scenarios, and we're working between those two posts. There's nothing in this strategy to say what those posts are, and I think it's a bit remiss not to have set them out, rather than just say, we're waiting until next month, because at that point, it will just be it will come out of the blue, so to speak, and I don't think that's right. I think they should have been laid in front of us.
I understand your point. I think we've been hoping for the last 3 weeks to know what the settlement was. And I appreciate that you would like figures. I understand that, because I like seeing the figures too. But I'll let Mark explain. And I do understand the point you're making, Councillor Molland, I really do. We did hope that we would have some good news to give. But, you know, we're still champing at the bit, so I do understand.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. Just in terms of the scenarios which you outlined just then, within the financial strategy we approved last year, we did set those scenarios out. So it's probably slightly remiss of me not to repeat them here, and I should have done so, apologies for that. But we did set out an optimistic scenario, a no change scenario, a pessimistic scenario, and then a reasonable worst case scenario within that document. So optimistic would have been, as you say, getting additional flexibility, being able to increase our operational establishment. The no change was kind of keep going as we are going, more or less, on a kind of similar path, saving money where we can, doing what we can to improve efficiencies, putting as much into the front line as we can, but recognising that we are going to be limited. And then obviously the pessimistic and the worst case scenarios were actually, if we get a really bad settlement, we may have to look at potentially closing stations or taking pumps off the run if we cannot afford to do those, because at the end of the day, we have a statutory duty to set a balanced budget and we cannot get away from that. So that was kind of the broad scenarios, and I'm as keen as you are to see that detail, and will certainly bring that as soon as I can.
Could you just send round those 3 scenarios from last year in the knowledge that, fingers crossed and toes crossed, that we might get the settlement that we're hoping for by the 16th of December? And obviously, if that really changes the scenario, then we will come back to members. So if you could do that, I'd be very grateful.
Yeah, yes, certainly, Chairman. I'll recirculate the document this afternoon.
Thank you.
And I'll also endeavour that as soon as we get the announcement of the settlement, I'll brief members informally on that as well.
Thank you. Councillor Chappell.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I must admit I'm having trouble hearing this morning. You're very quiet. You are very quiet. And I'm just catching half to 3/4 of maybe what's saying. Can I just ask some very simple questions from somebody who's only came on since May, so I can get some feel of figures? A 2% increase what does that equate to in money? A £5 that we're asking for, what does that work out percentage-wise and financial-wise, so I can compare one with the other? Yeah? There is, if we go to a referendum, the need to pay for that. I appreciate you might have got a reserve of 600,000, but if that wasn't needed, that could be spent more wisely. So that has got to be taken into account. But we've got to remember, a referendum only lasts for that year. So, you know, what you gain for 1 year, you've got to go through the process again, presuming if there's a 2% limit the following year. So, I mean, where does the percentage that comes in compare with the cost of going out to referendum, still with an uncertainty of whether that will achieve it? So it's basic figures I want. I appreciate the different levels of you know, critical and all that down through. I just want to get in my head basic figures. Thank you.
So I've got used to unmuting myself on Teams. I need to get used to putting my microphone on here now. So thank you, Councillor Chappell. Good questions. So these are very rough, round figures, but roughly speaking, 2% on our council tax would generate an additional £300,000 on the council tax in total. £5 increase would generate about £1.5 million. A £5 increase would equate roughly to about an 8% increase in our Band E equivalent. And in terms of the 1 year effect, yeah, the referendum is for 1 year, but say, for example, we went to referendum and they said, yes, we'll pay an extra £5, that'd be an extra £5 each and every year, so an extra £1.5 million each and every year. On top of that, it wouldn't drop out the following year.
Yeah, I appreciate the £5 would then be in the base budget, but would that £5 more than cover the need that we need, or would we be still looking to be above the top level the following year?
So I'll keep going back to settlement, but it does to a large degree depend on the settlement. In terms of the £5, that is primarily looking to increase the establishment rather than looking to keep us kind of balanced. In terms of a balanced budget, we're probably not going to be a million miles away from being balanced, assuming the settlement is roughly in line with where we think it's going to be. The £5 is really to address the HMIC cause for concern that we do not have the operational firefighters we say we need to address the risk to the public. So it's about addressing that cause for concern, putting us in the best position, rather than necessarily just about financial sustainability.
I've got two further questioners, Councillor Stutchbury and Councillor Christensen, and I'm not taking any more because we're at midday. We have 60 minutes. Please, will you make it
for 60
brief?
minutes.
I'm being really good to you today, again.
I know, it's so nice. I really appreciate it. The simple fact is that the settlement's there. The simple fact is that it's the council tax we're talking about, and as the officer so rightly and professionally mentioned, it's about staff, it's about recruitment, it's about retaining fire stations. So the simple answer is we are really at threat, and we have to be open about that. We are really at threat about having to take horrendous decisions which none of us here want to take. And I think when Councillor Mallam was explaining about the finances, we have to understand where we are, because when we take those decisions, we have to, even if we're not in agreement, be able to move forward in full knowledge of the facts. And I think that I respect the statements given. I respect it's going to go to the Executive Committee, but the Executive Committee isn't this full authority. So I do think that we do need a full comprehensive explanation of the finances, not what we were last year, because it's been 12 months since last year. We've had the pandemic, that's been terrible to people, and I do think we need that so we can quantify where we are, and if we're going to talk about closing fire stations, or if we're going to talk about not being able to recruit staff, that's a really serious matter, and we need the finances to be able to consider that properly. And it's not a criticism, I just want them to be delivered to us in a proper way, so that if those figures are going to the Executive Committee and something throws its head up, we do meet again to discuss that. We can't just waddle along, taking on, as Councillor Mallon said, we only have to look at what Northamptonshire did, and we don't want to be Northamptonshire, we're Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes, and we don't want to be them.
I can assure you we will not let the authority down, I can assure you, and any decisions will be a decision of this committee, so please don't think that we're just going to say yes. Now, I've got Jason Thelwell who'd like to say something, and then I'll hand to Mark. So, Mr. Thelwell.
Thank you, Chairman. I think the point to make about closing fire stations, etc., I think there's a number of points. Firstly, I don't think I've ever shied away as the Chief Fire Officer from saying that we're going to take some difficult decisions that may include closure of fire stations. I don't think over the years, I don't think I've ever done that. But I will say as well, our staff have come up with a number of innovative ways of working all the way through over the last number of years to maintain the number of fire engines and fire stations that we've got. We've reduced staffing has been reduced on whole-time fire stations by between 30 and 40% in the last decade, and yet we've not closed any fire stations and we've not removed any fire engines. And we've employed different ways of working, innovative ways of working, which includes flexi firefighters, the bank shifts, and all of that. And full credit needs to go to our staff, who definitely work differently to most other fire and rescue services, most other firefighters in the fire and rescue service. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I take Councillor Marlon's point, and he's right to make the point about what is the plan. What I don't want to do is set any hairs running to say we're going to close this, we're going to look at that, we're going to look at this, until we know what that settlement will be. If the settlement isn't what we think it's going to be, and it's pessimistic, proposals will be coming forward to say we need to look at this. It may include fire stations, it may include fire engines, but proposals will come forward to the authority to consider them in some depth. We've already heard about some of the recruitment challenges. One of the worst things we can do is say we're going to close this or we're going to do this, because people will not leave employment to come to a service where they think they're going to, there may not be enough jobs as we move forward. So that's one of the things we just need to guard against. In terms of to allay some fears as well, closing a fire station isn't an easy thing, and removal of fire engines isn't an easy thing to do. It requires extensive public consultation, and any public consultation documents must go through and will go through the authority to sign off in the first instance. So everybody will have the opportunity to see what the plans are, and everybody will have the opportunity to contribute and shape and change any to the final decision that goes forward. Picking up the chairman's point, I'm with the chairman on this in the sense that we just need to wait a couple more weeks to find out what the settlement will be. But after that, we will come forward with proposals to ensure a balanced budget over the next 3 years. And I hope that answers any questions or allays any fears.
And I would support that. It's exactly what we should do. Are you having problems hearing as well, or are you listening to your voicemail? Smack your hand. Do you want to respond, and then we have... you're okay?
Yeah,
Would you like to respond?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Just to reassure Councillor Stutchbury, the approval of the budget is a decision of the Fire Authority, so it goes to the Executive first, and then it's a recommendation to the Fire Authority. That report will be a detailed report with the figures that you need to make those decisions that we need to make in them. So, as the Chief Fire Officer says, once we have the settlement, we'll pull that report together and we'll circulate to members in good time so you have all the information to make any decision we may have to make.
Thank you. I think we're all very concerned about the settlement, and it has been one of those things that we've been pushing for quite a long time. There has been a lot of work done behind the scenes in trying to get that, and we just cannot get an answer. So I would suggest that we all keep our fingers crossed for the 16th, and that we might actually get the settlement that we've been pushing for the last 2, if not 3 years, and that has been cross-party. So the financial settlement strategy update is as Mark has outlined, and he will be sending us any further information, especially the questions that people have asked for some figures. We now go on to agenda item 10, which is the building risk review and protection update. I'm going to hand straight over to Group Commander Phil Mould, who is doing it remotely. Oh, Mr. Callum. Callum. I saw your face there. Are you going to say anything before Phil Mould, or we... You're on mute. I've always wanted to say that.
A second behind, and well pointed out. Thank you, Chairman. I wanted just to take the opportunity, Chairman, if it's okay with yourself, just to formally thank Phil Mould. Phil has changed roles within the service and moved into a different role, and I would like, if it's okay, just to say formally on behalf of the service, thank you to Phil for all he's done around the protection activity, and this is his latest and last update that he will give. Another officer will take the lead from that moving forward, but just to say formally thank you to Phil. Apologies if that was inappropriate, Chairman.
Thank you, and thank you for your input. Right, Mr. Mould, it's all over to you now. I echo what Mr. Bell said. I echo that too, because I know there's a lot of work being done, and I do thank you too. So, Mr. Mould, over to you.
Thank you, Callum. Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, and thank you all for your time this morning. This paper is broken down into several areas and is to provide a quarterly update on the protection team's progress against the building risk review and the protection activity. Conscious of the authority's time, I won't go over all the areas covered individually, but pick out some notable points. The building risk review, which must be completed by 31st of December this year, has progressed well over the last year or so. And I am pleased to report that the returns have been submitted to the Protection Policy and Reform Unit against all of the 57 premises identified within Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes. And the PPRU have confirmed that the programme has been completed for this service. So I'm really pleased to be able to inform the authority of that point. And that's a month ahead of schedule. The Protection Policy Reform Unit are now undertaking quality assurance of the data sets returned by all services, which may require further work by protection teams just to provide some validation. We continue to deliver the Protection Uplift Programme, utilising associated grant funding to deliver improvements in fire safety delivery, response staff knowledge and support wider business engagement. We have secured fire safety training for operational staff. A pilot was delivered to a dozen flexi-duty officers last month, with a second running today and tomorrow at headquarters. Following this and any necessary amendments to feedback and clarity around the Fire Safety Act, the training will be rolled out to crews. The training will broadly cover relevant legislation and any changes, the built environment and fire safety requirements. Training has been provisionally booked to start in January. Other areas covered within the paper are business engagement, technology considerations, competency, fire standards, the Fire Safety Act 2021, which is due to go live in the very near future, and an update on the Building Safety Bill's passage towards receiving royal assent in spring/summer in 2022. I'll leave it there, Chairman, and open up if there was any questions, please.
Could I just ask a question, probably out of left field? In your pie chart, which is the initial assessment outcome, what sort of things are not in scope?
So the scope of the project was 18-metre plus residential premises. So anything below 18 metres was out of scope. Hotels and commercial high-rise premises over 18 metres.
Okay, thank you. And also, are we yet a consultee on planning for any buildings over 3 floors? We've asked the planning departments of the councils. Have we had any response to see if we would be statutory consultees, or at least consultees on anything that is over 3 floors?
As you'll be aware, we are statutory consultees under the building regulation consultation. I would have to refer to Callum for an update on the wider planning point.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, so following the discussions we've had previously, we did have conversations with the leads for planning both in Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes, conscious of the approach the Milton Keynes Council took around permitted developments. And we have had those conversations, and the offer of the experiences that Milton Keynes Council had around the approach they took and the learns was left as an open invitation to the leads for Buckinghamshire Council should they wish to explore that particular line.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yes, Councillor McLean.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Phil. I read the papers yesterday afternoon. Very comprehensive set they were indeed. Just comments on the one thing on Peter Marlin being the Cabinet member responsible for planning may want to comment is that last week we at Development Control approved the development at Saxon Court will have a 34-storey block of flats, so that's a little more than 18 metres. But the question is that having read them, and I don't claim to have read every page, I did notice that in Appendix 7, which refers to the draft bill that you referred to will be hopefully passed in the spring, summer next year, Phil, there's a change and it refers to an accountable person rather than a responsible person. Could you just outline what the differences are in terms, is there a legal definition that's been changed? So someone who's a responsible person now who might become an accountable person needs to do more than they're currently doing?
That's a really, really good question. And some of those areas, as you'll see by the timescales of the building safety bill, haven't been finalised because there will be crossover between the responsible person is identified under the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order and the accountable person will be identified under the Building Safety Bill. So there will be crossover. Exactly what that is, we won't understand until there's been further passage of the bill.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Stutchbury.
I'll be brief. Just the letter from the Secretary of Lord Grinham, I can't pronounce his name, but I don't suppose you'll mind. He's a titled man, he's sure not to worry about that. The letter from him, although it's a detailed letter, it's disappointing, isn't it, that the tragedy it refers to, Grenfell Tower, is 2017, and we're now in 2021, and we still haven't actually able to quantify how that's going to, what lessons learned is going to improve services, and how we're going to actually plan for it. Taking on board my friend, Councillor, saying that we're building higher properties, we do need to know that. It's very unsatisfactory, not for the people involved and tragic loss in it. It's just very unsatisfactory these matters aren't resolved more quickly, because we do need to make improvements, we do need to plan, and we do maybe need to buy different equipment in the years to come with the recommendations, so it's not easy. I just think that letter's not as succinct as I would have liked it to have been. It's a letter response, it isn't a detailed response to the problem facing the country.
Would you like to answer that question, if there was a question there?
Chairman, it's okay, I can take that question. So, and thank you for the question, Councillor Stutchbury. We are managing the outcomes of the Grenfell Tower inquiry. Phil's update is around the outcomes from the changes in legislation. We are providing updates to the authority on our action plan around the outcomes of the Grenfell Tower inquiry, and those updates are going through to O&A, and we will continue to provide updates on what we are doing around policy for response, equipment and procedure. And just to assure the authority members, we are and we will continue to be on the front foot with those particular issues.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Rankin?
Thank you. I had a question on inspection costs, which seems to be covered by a government grant of 850 for the first year and then subsequent years £400. It sounds like there might be a risk that the Fire Authority will bear in extra costs. Is there anything in the legislation that actually puts costs, say for new builds, onto the owners?
Thank you, Councillor. So within the Building Safety Bill, there are some processes for reclaiming costs associated directly with work and burdens placed under the Building Safety Bill. As you point out, we have received a grant to assist us with third-party accreditation. And that is actually something which is mirrored under the Fire Safety Act, which will go live, as I say, imminently. So directly for the accreditation, the NFCC, the National Fire Chiefs Council, are continuing to lobby themselves for further grants to support that ongoing costs of accreditation.
Thank you. Councillor Marland.
Thank you. I should probably declare an interest as I recently looked at purchasing one, but it's not just high-rise buildings actually. More buildings now, even low-rise buildings, are becoming timber frame and timber frame only. And my question is actually, what risk does that pose in terms of both spread, but also in terms of if it's high-rise building, that's obviously an exception. If most buildings are going to be timber frame in the future, that's the rule, that will be an awful lot of responsibility to basically comment on every single planning application, and it's just around the capacity that would take, and what are the risk and reward for that, so to speak. But it is, I think it is worth saying that timber frame buildings are now going to become the norm rather than the exception, and low-rise buildings are the norm rather than the exception, and so effectively we will be looking at are we looking at higher risks for all buildings, and if so, how? That's a huge added burden to the authority, really.
Very good point. Yes, Mr. Osborne?
Yeah, just on that specific point around timber framed and low-rise buildings, we've seen a huge increase in timber frame buildings, as you mentioned, over the last couple of decades in that respect, and it comes back to regulation and legislation in that if they're built correctly, they're not a huge risk to us or the people that live in them. It's when they're not built correctly, which is, as we've seen, some of the outcomes from Grenfell around the whole industry piece. And you're quite right, the burden on us to inspect or to be consultees on every low-rise timber frame building we wouldn't be able to cope with that from a capacity perspective. But I think this is more around us engaging with developers, engaging with the local authorities around how those are approved and how building control works better, how approved inspectors work better, etc. So, yeah, it's not a new risk to us, but absolutely we're very aware of that burden and probably more aware than we've ever been.
Do you want to come back on that?
Come back on that, I think it was last month, the month before, Milton Keynes Council unanimously passed a motion regarding Grenfell, but within that motion, it was requested that I wrote to the Secretary of State regarding building control and its privatisation effectively, and strengthening building control measures. It may be helpful if the Fire Authority was to look at that motion, and if the chair sort of wanted to support that around making sure that building control is effective, because if it's not, then that's been a major issue.
Could you actually send us that document and possibly a copy of your letter? Because I think that this is where we do have to start, working together. The other problem that we also have is the way that buildings are changed. Somebody decides that it's not going to be retail, it's now going to be a flat, and they go up through the various things. So I think you're right, building control does have to be strengthened somewhat. But thank you for that. Gentlemen, do you want to add to anything on that? No? Councillor Hopkins.
I will very quickly. I'm very conscious of the time, but Pete makes a very, very good point. But I think legislation has tightened up quite substantially in recent years. I think the point for us in Milton Keynes, to some extent, I'm sure elsewhere, is an awful lot of Milton Keynes in the early days was built as timber frame, where the standards were not as they are today. And I think our concern is not so much, or should not be, not so much around what is being constructed now, but actually looking back at what we need to be looking at in terms of regeneration and retrospective legislation. And that's the challenge both for the government and also for local authorities.
I totally agree. I think, to be honest, it's, dare one say, it's opened a can of worms that we all sort of know that there's a lot to do, and it's actually having the manpower, and I use the word manpower for both sexes, that it is something that is a complete worry, and especially when you see buildings being transferred from retail to residential in town centres. And not to mention Milton Keynes high-rise flats. So if we go then back to page 65 of the agenda pack, it's recommended that the building risk review and protection update be noted. Can we agree that, please? Agreed. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Bell and Mr. Mould, for your input here. And we wish, if you're going to sign off before we finish, shall we give you compliments of the season? Although I think one of you prefers the 1st of January or the 31st of December rather than the 1st of January. So whatever.
No comment.
Whatever. Best wishes and stay safe.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you. We go to agenda item 11, and this is Councillor Keith McLean. You'll introduce this and then hand over, I believe.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. I'm very pleased to be introducing the Health, Safety and Wellbeing Annual Report for the second year as the lead member. For all of us, particularly the service, this year has been completely overshadowed by COVID-19, as you'll have read in the report. The service has responded to the demands of the pandemic with fortitude, implementing robust procedures quickly and efficiently, which is evidenced by both the small numbers of positive cases amongst the staff and the outcomes of the Health and Safety Executives' COVID spot audits on stations and at headquarters. The external work carried out by some firefighters, officers and support staff in assisting our partner agencies included driving ambulances, delivering PPE to other organisations, delivering medication and food to those members of the public who were shielding, and setting up and running mass vaccination centres. And all this is whilst maintaining the core business of the service throughout. All of which exemplifies the ethos of this service. I'm proud that the health, safety and wellbeing statistics continue to demonstrate how importantly we all treat these matters. However, we should not be complacent and must continue to reduce the risks to our employees and the public we serve. Just before I hand over to Ali, I'd just like to pay tribute to Ali and her team, a small team, but dedicated and helping this service to be as safe and secure as possible. So Ali, over to you.
Thank you very much, Councillor McLean. Thank you, Chair. So as Councillor McLean has already said, the services had to focus primarily on the response to, recovery from and managing the COVID-19 pandemic as new variants emerge whilst maintaining business as usual. This has proved challenging at times, especially during the 4 lockdowns, with non-operational personnel working from home for much of the year and operational personnel being placed at risk of transmission of the virus when serving the community. It is to be noted that cases of COVID in the service for the year up to the 31st of March 2021 have been very low at 38, which is testament to the commitment of staff in adhering to the COVID secure measures in place. Early in the pandemic, the Health and Safety Executive went on record stating that should they receive a complaint from an employee concerned about the COVID-19 measures in their workplace, they would carry out a full investigation. To date, I'm pleased to say that has not occurred in this service, and we have been inspected on spot audits, COVID-19 spot audits, at 4 stations and at headquarters, with excellent outcomes at each. There has been no requirement for any further action, and comments received from the inspectors have been favourable. Throughout the year, the service has assisted partner agencies and local authorities in ways that have never been experienced before. Whilst each activity came with its own challenges, the tenacity and commitment of staff ensured our participation was a success. As these activities were over and above what staff would normally undertake, the service was very cognizant of the potential impacts on both their physical and mental health and well-being. An example of how this was managed was by releasing operational staff who had volunteered to drive ambulances from their fire service duties and to provide them with time off prior to them returning. Access to additional trauma support and welfare support networks was also provided by both ourselves and Central Ambulance South Central Ambulance Service. The Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services conducted a COVID-19 inspection in November 2020. The headline of the report read, "Buckinghamshire Fire and Rescue Service has been praised for the way it is coping with the challenges it faces during the COVID-19 pandemic and for the positive contribution it is making to its community," which was a very positive outcome for us. Moving on to our actual health and safety performance over this year, we'll look at the graph on page 11. So overall, there have been reductions in 5 of the 7 categories, which is a considerable improvement in the performance compared to last year. I just want to point out the near miss on the graph and explain what that might be for some that may not be familiar with this term. So a near miss is something that has the ability to cause injury or loss through damage. So a near miss allows the service to investigate those and put in measures to prevent an actual occurrence, actually occurring. So a near miss is a good thing, and you'll notice that the arrow is on a downward trend, and we've had less of the near miss reports. So we want to see those increase. So it's about constant education of our staff and reminding them of this. Personal injury, vehicle safety events, acts of violence, and the number of events that come under the reporting of injuries, diseases, and dangerous occurrence regulations have all decreased. There has been a significant decrease in the total number of persons injured from 38 in 2019-20 to 24 in 2021. Of these, 17 occurred at training events, 3 during routine activities, and 4 at fires. Due to GDPR requirements, we are unable to break down said injuries further, as it may be possible for individuals involved to be identified. If we look at the league tables at the back of the report, this is the league tables that are produced by the statistics that we all submit to the Home Office every year, and it's for injuries to firefighters. The 12 services in the tables are of a similar size and demographic compared to ourselves, so it allows us to compare apples with apples as far as is possible. Of the 7 tables, we are in the top 3 in 6 and hold top place in 3. In each, number of injuries has either remained the same or decreased, which is a very positive result. The worst position in the tables is the number of injuries that have occurred during training. Analysis can only identify that more training took place over the year due to a fall in the number of fire calls and being unable to carry out community activities during the lockdown periods. I'm nearly there. I just want to highlight working time regulation breaches. This service has implemented a robust monitoring system for recording and monitoring the number of hours worked and the rest taken by our employees. The Health and Safety Executive has been noted for stating that if an accident occurs to a firefighter which is of a major nature or worse, the first thing they will look at is firefighter fatigue. So we've introduced this system, and from April 2020 to March 21, there were 3,822 bank shifts worked, and of those, there were 7 breaches. A breach will occur when a worker does not have a full 24 hours uninterrupted rest break in any 7 days, or 48 hours in 14 days, or the total of hours worked per week exceeds 84. The service has implemented a limit on the number of hours worked at 78 per week in order to build in extra protection against fatigue for staff. Additionally, they are provided with 2 periods of 24 hours rest in accordance with the Grey Book conditions. These figures are a significant improvement from the previous year, which provides assurance to the authority that should the Health and Safety Executive conduct an inspection on the service, there is a robust and effective monitoring process in place. Just to give you a brief look forward, as a result of the pandemic, we've been provided the opportunity to look at how we work as an organisation. With support staff working from home, productivity increased as employees did not have to make the commute into the workplace during lockdown, and the systems technology available enabled work to be carried out efficiently. Working from home is not suited to everyone. The lifting of government restrictions has meant that employees can return to the workplace in a safe and managed way. Moving forwards, the service has taken the opportunity to explore the ways in which people work and how they prefer to work. This work will inform how hybrid working can be implemented throughout the service for those groups of staff who are able to work both from home and in the workplace. However, this is not an option for all staff due to the nature of their role. A project is in its infancy, and it's called Work Evolution, the strapline being work is what we make it, and an update will be provided to you all in next year's report. Hopefully that didn't take me too long to go through, so I'm very happy to take any questions that you may have. Thank you.
I think you stunned everybody into silence. We should have... No. Councillor Rankin.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to pick up a bit on the Blue Light Hub wellbeing benefits. I haven't been able to speak to the firefighters at the Bletchley station, but I did speak to the community officers, police officers in the Bletchley police station, and the conditions there, they said, were pretty awful, and they were desperate to get to the Blue Hub. And I see it looks like there's anecdotal evidence of the welfare benefits to the Blue. I just wonder if there was a formal survey, because we might want to build more Blue Hubs at some point, and I think actually having the evidence through a formal survey would be useful in terms of comparing facilities that are in the old stations versus what's available in the new hub. Would be useful.
Yes, that's a very good point. Thank you, Councillor. It is certainly something that we will be looking at to talk. Sorry. It is something that we will be looking at. Obviously, we moved in June 2020. South Central Ambulance moved in October 20, and Thames Valley Police moved in February 2021. So it is something that we can look at as part of the evaluation of the success of the project moving forwards. Having had conversations with the police inspector who is based at the Blue Light Hub, they are absolutely overjoyed. They've got a gym, they've got suitable lighting, heating, and they love the fact that they've got communal areas that they can relax in. And they are absolutely overjoyed with it. In fact, he did say to me, we keep telling your crews to stop moaning because they don't know they're bored, which is very good for us. So yes, that is certainly something we can look at, and it is becoming more popular throughout the National Fire Service and the other blue light services to actually work together. It certainly helps us to achieve our operation objectives, having us all together in one building. Thank you.
Councillor Bagg.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to thank you for the in-depth details in the report, which is extremely comprehensive. I have to declare that having read through the report, I mean, obviously as a layperson on the street, I kind of had this notion that being a firefighter is a risky, hazardous, dangerous sort of career. But looking at the numbers of injuries, both in training and actually at fires, it really brought home to me how risky the role of being a firefighter is, and how much the public has to be grateful that they entrust their safety to the hands of firefighters who take on the risks to protect the wider safety. So I just want to say that I think it's a fascinating report, really eye-opening. And thank you for the staff who do such a great job, take on risks and get injured, whether in training or actually at fires. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't think there was a question, but I think we all echo your sentiments. Thank you. Councillor Carroll.
An observation, Madam Chairman. Firstly, fantastic report, and well done the lead member as well, who is in the team, and obviously the chair as well. It was mentioned about the Blue Light Hub, which fortunately I had a lot to do with, but the officers set the pace. But I think it's another scenario where we ought to be proud of what we've done in this authority, and well done the chairman as well. Would it be possible, and I've asked Mark to try and set this again in the future, new members particularly, if in next year, if it's okay, to go over to see the Blue Light Hub and what we actually achieved over there?
Again, I don't think there was a question.
No, absolutely. Once we are able to do what we would like to be able to do, then you'll be more than welcome.
I seriously think that the Blue Light Hub is the way forward for the blue light services. I seriously do. And I think it does show that it works, and in places that it's happening, it is proving to be one of those things that, yes, we've got to take it forward. And we will have to look at how we can actually implement that. I hope that members would agree that we should minute our thanks to both Ali's team and also every member of staff of the Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes Fire Authority for all the work they've done during the pandemic. You know, when we've had, I think you said 38 cases, which is absolutely phenomenal. I think that I would like to suggest that we minute that. I hope that I might have a seconder for my proposal. Thank you, Mr. Stutchbury. And I don't believe members of the public actually understand what firefighting means today. I really don't. And what Councillor Bagg has actually said is exactly the same. We don't understand exactly what the fire service does to keep us safe. So we go to the recommendation then on page 185, and that is the authority notes this health and safety and well-being performance as detailed in the Health and Safety and Wellbeing Annual Report for 2020-2021. Are we in agreement? And my thanks to the lead member, Councillor McLean, for the work that you've been doing on this, because it's not one of those things that you can just, you know, write the report and then say that's good. But so thank you for that. Thank you.
Chair, can I just add my thanks to Councillor McLean as well, because he's been very helpful and very supportive since he's been the lead member. I'm very grateful for that. Thank you.
I would echo that. So thank you very much indeed. Okay, we now go to item 12 on the agenda, which is the Firefighters Charity, which is pages 215 to 220. And Station Commander Adam Birch will do a quick presentation. You notice the word quick. Thank you, Mr. Birch.
Thank you very much. And this will be quick, but it's a really positive presentation for us to end on. So I'll be welcome to take any questions at the end. So just as you'll be pleased, there's only 4 slides, but there's, and they're specifically focused on fundraising and an activity update. So I recently took over as the organisation's lead for the Firefighters Charity. So I work quite closely with our regional reps for the Firefighters Charity to ensure that we continue to look at the likes of fundraising activity that's happening within service, and also looking at some of their services, the way in which they're changing, adapting to make sure that they continue to support our beneficiaries. So I just want to cover a few different things that are coming forward shortly within service. One in particular, which is really pleasing to see, is Living Well groups. So Living Well groups offer somewhere to socialise and reminisce for fellow retired members of the Fire and Rescue Service. So back in 2018, it was noticed from the charity that they were finding it extremely difficult to interact with retired members of staff who also remain beneficiaries of the Firefighters Charity. And they came up with a very, very simple concept, and that's to bring back staff back into a familiar environment and create a social opportunity. It was really, really positive, and we're looking now to introduce these in service. There's monthly, so they happen on a monthly basis. There'll be roughly 2-hour sessions. There'll be guest speakers at each one. There'll be access to charity services, and refreshments will be provided. This is a real positive for us, and we think it will be a really good way in which we can interact with some of our retired members of staff. Something that will also help us to agree some of the objectives that were set in the 2020 to 2025 people strategy. and will continue to complement the ongoing work of the Welfare Officer, looking at improving the communications and support we provide to retired members of the firefighters, of the fire services community. So a real positive news story for us is our 6 monthly report. So working closely with the charity, we receive a fundraising update based on the progress we've made as an organisation in raising money for the charity. The 6 monthly report gave us up-to-date figures to the end of September, and it's broken down into 5 key areas, which is events, fire service lottery, fire service regular giving, individual giving and recycling, which is predominantly the clothing banks that you can see placed on many of our fire stations and also headquarters. 2020 to 2021 was a really challenging year for the Firefighters charity due to a lack of opportunity to fundraise, as you can imagine, due to the impacts of the pandemic. However, the fundraising update for the first 6 months is really positive, and event fundraising has increased by 341%, and recycling income has increased by 197%. So looking at a year on year, we're up approximately £16,525, so up 116% year on year in terms of actual fundraising. Some real significant increases are, there was 2 significant events which are really worth noting, which was the Tunnel to Towers event that took place on the 11th of September, which was to commemorate the 20-year anniversary of the 9/11 attacks that happened back in 2001, raising in excess of £7,809 for the Firefighters charity. A number of members of staff from across a range of different departments made their way from the Blue Light Hub to the Escape Building in Milton Keynes, simulating the same sort of distance and situation that an individual, Stephen Siller, took on that day in 2001 in New York, where sadly he lost his life trying to ensure that he was providing a service to the people of New York City. So in addition to that, it's worth noting is that £605 was also raised for a charity dedicated in Stephen Siller's memory. In addition to that as well, there was a Chesham to Brighton bike ride that raised in excess of £4,000 as well for the charity, so that was a roaring success as well, and we should really sort of note and thank all the different members of staff, especially the on-call unit at Chesham, who dedicated a lot of time in order to fundraise and obviously train extremely hard to not only carry out the London to Brighton bike ride, they had to go in addition and step away from Chesham Fire Station, which meant the actual distance they travelled was in excess of 100 miles, so really well done to them. And as I mentioned before as well, really positive news in terms of the recycling income, which has really helped to put us in a much better position, raising in excess of £30,000 currently for this financial year. So in order to look at some projected income as well, which provides us with some positive reading as well, I've broken down some key areas that I think are worth noting. Some notes of thanks that have come in, so post-incident recognition is really, really important. In excess of £3,000 in donations have been raised from the Stokenchurch community, alongside £500 in funding from pupils of Stokenchurch Primary School, as a means of thank you for the hard work and dedication shown by the operational crews responding to the King's Head Hotel fire in October 2021. So that is money that has been assigned to the charity on behalf of, as a thanks, which is not factored into our current figures that we've provided in that 6 monthly report. In addition to that, hopefully you can recall, in 2020 we held our last cultural survey. We managed to raise in excess of £1,700 for the charity, following the agreement by the authority to donate £5 for every staff member that provides a survey response. The next cultural survey will take place in January 2022, prior to the end of the financial year, and we anticipate raising a similar total for the charity. Communications are going out, if not already today, tomorrow, in order to start to encourage and raise the profile of the cultural survey and the fact that we can not only encourage people to have a voice within service, but also raise money for a really, really important charity. In addition to that, we do have charity car washes scheduled in for March 2022 at various different locations across the site, across the service. And we've also got charity collections at various different fire stations that are planned in December. High Wycombe being a highlight, which is taking place on this Saturday in the Eden Centre. In addition to that, as you can imagine, it's been really difficult for us to do some traditional fundraising methods over the sort of pandemic period. But as we start to sort of evolve and look at the way in which we operate and make sure we support our staff to kind of bring back some of our business as usual, we've looked to ensure that we've got perhaps greater control and greater support for people who look to fundraise. So a digital event registration form has been created, and this will automatically notify the health and safety team, the communications team, and myself as a charity coordinator with details regarding any future events that are planned in service. This approach will allow us to support the planning stage of any event to ensure appropriate risk assessments are completed, event insurance is considered, and a communication plan is placed in place to maximise the opportunity to raise the profile and outreach of all future fundraising events, providing that support to our members of staff that really want to make a difference and support a really important charity. And finally, you'll be pleased it's the last slide, but again, a really, really positive slide, is one that's just highlighting just how important these clothing banks are across our different sites in Buckinghamshire. I can give you some cumulative totals. Since as early as 2010, we placed our first clothing bank at our sites, and to date, although this figure has increased since I've put this presentation together, which is even more pleasing, is that we've raised in excess of £118,000 through clothing recycling alone, which is in excess of 618 tonnes of clothing, which has managed to make its way through our recycling banks and generating some really, really important income, which is really, really pleasing. And we're looking to see how we can sort of thank the community and anybody who supports this by having performance posters on each location, and looking to really start to promote again and encourage people to use these recycling banks, because they really are generating a meaningful amount of income for the charity and making a really meaningful difference. So thank you very much. That's just a brief update in terms of where we're at. I'll be more than happy to take any questions if anybody has any. Thank you.
Councillor Hopkins.
Well, thank you, and congratulations, and an excellent report, and grateful to see how well you're doing. I have to report from Milton Keynes that the Tunnel to Towers, let's call it an event, challenge, that's better, was incredibly well received, attracted enormous positive publicity within Milton Keynes. Not that you needed any more positive publicity, but it was very well received and well covered. Can I just ask, I think I did this at the briefing, but can I just ask about the clothing banks? Some of the stations in Milton Keynes are inaccessible, as it were, and therefore not suitable. But I wonder if we can come to arrangements with maybe parish, town, councils or sports clubs to see if we can locate the clothing banks on non-fire station sites, because it's a good way to, obviously, say, to increase the level of income. And very popular as well, clothing banks.
And could I just add to that? I've spoken to a couple of schools in High Wycombe, noticing that we've discussed the High Wycombe station, and they suggest or ask, is there a possibility of having a collection once a year at those schools in aid of the fire brigade charity? So adding on to the parish, because we're unparished in High Wycombe, so we don't have a parish council. So thank goodness. We have a little bit of a problem. Councillor McLean, do you want to ask your question, and then you can perhaps wrap
I was
up?
going to add something that David said, but ask another question, so deal with that point and I'll come back in, Chair.
Yeah, thank you very much. So in terms of clothing banks at different locations other than fire stations, we've been in discussions with the recycling lead for the charity, and they are extremely supportive of additional banks being placed across Buckinghamshire. We are one of the best generators of recycling income across the whole of the UK, based on the number of locations that we have and the total weight that's kind of been put through each of those banks each year. So they're extremely supportive of this. They currently have roughly around 950 banks across the country. They're looking to, it's called Challenge 1000, looking to increase to in excess of 1,000. And they're very, very supportive, and will welcome site assessments anywhere that they deem suitable that are going to generate a decent income. So I'll be more than happy to support that and liaise with the charity on that.
Councillor Stutchbury, last word.
Firstly, thank you for the report. It's uplifting and engaging. It's really a question, stroke a proposal. is it possible, listening to the engagement and well-being section of retired firefighters, and there may be a good reason why it can't happen, that they could retain access to use of the gym material, the gym within the fire station. That would maintain continuity of comradeship and friendship within the fire service, and may offer them a good route to stay fit and healthy in retirement. There is a danger when you give up work that you get slightly tubby, and like myself, and you lose that ready fitness. When I left the farm and became a carer, that's different for a long time carer for my late wife. You lose that continuity of activity, and lose body tone and one thing and another. So if it's possible to look at that, I think it would be a really good thing for the well-being and mental well-being of the firefighters, and going forward. It may be a good reason why it can't happen, but I think it's a good thing to consider.
Yes, I'd be more than happy to come in there. I think you raised a really important point, and I think that the introduction of these living well groups will start to identify opportunities and ways in which we can continue to engage and embed them back into the service, if you like, because it's really important. You're absolutely right. I don't see anything that you discuss as being a particular challenge, to be honest. I think that the first step is to re-engage with some of these members of staff, introduce them back into the service. And it's really important to note as well is actually that these living well groups are not going to be driven just by existing members of staff. We've got volunteers that are going to look to coordinate these, which are serving firefighters who are looking to kind of manage these sessions. So we're not sort of second guessing what we think the individual will want. They're being run by people that we know we need to engage with. So yeah, I don't see that being an issue at all.
Oh, through the
Just
chair,
a second. Mr. Osborne.
Yeah, just on that, and to support what Adam's saying, is about that engagement piece. I saw Ali sort of shudder a little bit there around potential risk assessments and other aspects from a health and safety perspective, and there's obviously a public liability bit that I saw Mark almost falling into his chair on as well. But just to support Adam in this as well around that engagement piece, we've been doing some sessions as well, some drop-in sessions for Armed Forces veterans. So we'll also be looking at how that comes together as well, so we can support other people in our communities as well, linking it back to the charity. So we'll be doing a lot in that area, but they're really good points, so thank you for that.
Thank you. I know the chair listened intently. Can I leave it with you and the chair to discuss whether it's legally possible? Alison's only known me for over 50 years, so she knows that I'm high risk. So,
I can assure you she's not the only one.
Yeah, so I think that, if you can look at it sympathetically, and if there's some way forward, I joke about these things, but it is very important. Mental well-being is the real point that towers off with people, and they don't get it back. Thank you.
Totally agree. And as Mr. Osborne has said, we were given the Silver Award for the British Legion. Well, it wasn't. It was the Silver Award for Armed Forces, the Covenant. And I think both of these things actually wrap around together, because they're both looking after former people in either in the service per se. And I think it's an absolutely ideal. I don't know whether they could all use the gym equipment, because I just kept thinking, oh my goodness. So we won't go there, but it will certainly be looked into. So thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Birch, for your presentation. Councillor McLean.
Thank you very much, Chair. Pick up, I did go to the Tunnel to Tower event, and it was a great event, very moving. Some of the guys did look a little tired at the end of it. I think Casey's son was there. So I think that it was a great fundraiser, and also, as David said, it raised the profile significantly in the city centre. The worst thing about it was it's outside McDonald's, and the smell of burning fat was not good. In terms of the clothing banks, I live in a small village called Emberton. About 3 years ago, someone approached the village sports hall committee and asked whether they could put a children's air ambulance bin there or container there. It fills up about every 3 to 4 months. So I think the idea of finding some locations in some villages that have nothing else, or smaller communities is probably a good way of raising funds very quickly. And Mick's picked up on my third point, which was the armed forces, that the living well, which I thought that was a fantastic idea. There's obviously armed forces, there are serve police officers, SCAS officers, maybe something to start with the Blue Light Hub, bring the three services past serving officers together and then invite the armed forces as well. But I think it was a fantastic initiative and really pleased to read about it, Adam. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. So we note your report. Thank you very much. The date of the next meeting is Wednesday the 16th of February 2022 at 11 a.m. and that will be held here. And I hope those people that got all their emails and whatever done during the meeting are happy with their responses to their emails. I wish I could have done some as well. However, can I please wish you all a very happy Christmas and all the best wishes for 2022. Please do keep safe, keep well, most of all, and with the weather being so cold, keep warm. So thank you very much indeed, everybody, and safe journey home. Thank you.